How long will that talk take?
Less than an hour. I have until 6 o'clock to cram all this in.
You can run long too if you want.
That's okay. It shouldn't take that long. Okay, so we ready to go? Alrighty, can everybody see my screen okay?
Yes.
All right, perfect. Let's see. How about if I do it that way? Get rid of some of the noise. So this is about digital mobile radio and the amateur radio, and specifically in the Pacific Northwest digital system. So it was originally written by Brady Still in 7ER and presented by me in 9VW. A couple of disclaimers. I do not represent the WWARA and cannot speak to the recent narrowbanding announcement proposal, but I can get you information if you require it. I am not advocating DMR or PNWDigital as the only narrowbanding option. There are several. Most of the DMR system referenced here are based on the PNWDigital system, which is a C-Bridge based repeater system in Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and British Columbia. Other systems are Brandmeister and TGIF systems, which unfortunately I have little knowledge or experience with. And please feel free to ask questions along the way. I am not watching the chat app, so if somebody can keep track of that or let me know, I'm happy to stop at any point in time and answer any questions that you may have. Alrighty, background. So digital mobile radio, or just simply DMR, as an industry, we have this habit of abbreviating everything under the sun, was developed in Europe by the European Telecom Standards Institute, ETSI, and was adopted as commercial standard in 2005. California hams started deploying DMR after a local event caused a surplus of DMR equipment. How fortunate. In 2010, Mount Diablo in San Francisco Bay Area had the first ham DMR repeater. Initially, commercial radio vendors were the only source of DMR handhelds and mobiles, specifically Motorola, Hytera, and Yaesu. In 2013, several vendors entered the ham radio DMR market. These radios are a bit more affordable and designed to be ham friendly. These are from the likes of Anytone, Connect Systems, Radio Oddity, Baofeng, right on down the line. Something that I didn't know coming into this, but looked up on June 9th in 2014, the FCC officially approved the use of time division multiplex, or TDMA, which is the modulation type used by DMR for ham radio use. And there was actually some concern by users as to whether or not it was legal because it wasn't spelled out, so that helped. Some DMR radios can be made Part 90 compliant, and this is ideal for hams that also have access to public safety or private radio systems. That's kind of a story in itself. There are 3 tiers, only 2 of which are used in the US. Tier 1 is an unlicensed digital PMR or European licensed free system. What we use as amateurs is Tier 2 conventional, which are direct or repeated non-trunked systems. And then Tier 3 are trunked radio systems, where you have a pool of radio channels that are assigned on the fly. Requires much more extensive equipment on both the network side and the user equipment to support trunking systems. It's much more for public safety and things of that nature that require a lot of voice channels that work very efficiently. There is robust forward error correction. Sounds pretty good in low signal conditions. For a DMR repeater, the input and output frequencies are just like an analog repeater. Standard offsets, unless they've been coordinated differently, which is very unusual. To accommodate many talk groups, which we'll learn about here, you will likely have 8 to 20 radio channels programmed with the same repeater frequencies and other settings, but just differ with the talk group number and alphanumeric tag on the channel. Then you just change the channel to change your active talk group. So a little technical background. The system uses a 12.5 kilohertz channel. It is narrowband with 2 time slots, which gives an equivalent of 6.25 kilohertz per talk path, which is actually the goal of the FCC, that a talk path be 6.25 kilohertz. So this is kind of a unique way of getting around that. And if you look at the chart over on the side, you can see that the 2 time slots are just divided up. The frequency is 12.5 kilohertz wide. Am I talking too low? Okay. The first slot is sent for 30 milliseconds, then the second slot, then the first slot, the second slot. And this is called time division multiple access. It's been used in the cellular industry as part of AT&T and T-Mobile's second generation systems, were TDMA. With 2 time slots in the DMR repeater, there can be 2 independent simultaneous conversations carried on the repeater, 1 per time slot. 50% duty cycle. You're only listening to 1 time slot at a time. So, or actually transmitting on 1 time slot at a time, which makes it much easier on the battery. So battery life is consequently extended. As mentioned before, it does have state-of-the-art forward error correction, which gives you, it accommodates dropped bits and munged bits and puts them back together and makes audio sound pretty intelligible. DVSI, the good folks at Digital Voice Systems, Inc., have the AMBI2 Advanced Multiband Excitation vocoder, which is a voice coder and encoder, or a codec. These provide good voice quality and are robust against strong background noise. The system can support some data service, such as short text messaging, but they are radio make dependent, and mostly Motorola, because the system's based on Motorola repeaters and what have you. A lot of the foreign Chinese manufacturers have not really adhered to the standard that ETSI defined. And also Motorola on their network use what's called IP Site Connect, which is a tad different on the network side. So getting all of these variables to work and play nice together is somewhat of a challenge. Digital APRS and other data services are available on the PNWDigital for some radio vendors. Actually, digital APRS works very well. Call types and features. So everything on the PNW system is a group call on a talk group. There's really no support for the next one, which is private call. The Brandmeister system does allow private call, which is pretty handy. You can, if you want to call your friend, you can put in their specific DMR ID and call them directly. This C-Bridge based system does not support it, or at least it's not enabled. Again, short data messaging is manufacturer dependent. Location is done via both digital APRS with Anytone radios, or it will support analog APRS, which for the new folks that were out there is automatic position reporting service. Radio check with audio talk group to see your levels. It's a pretty handy little graph. It shows you your average voice level and the peak voice level. on a little bar graph so you can see what your audio levels look like. Or you can use the Parrot Talk group rather than just asking for a radio check which is somewhat subjective. We have a gentleman that did a set of recordings for us named Duff, WA7BFN. And when you talk into it, he'll give a preamble welcoming you to the system. You'll hear your voice, and then you'll hear his on the way out announcing that the Parrot service is clear. It's very handy to measure the level. You can hear it for yourself if your audio is too hot or too weak. So it's a pretty handy way for you to see how your radio is performing against the rest of the system. And hot audio is something that you need to be aware of because it gets really, really harsh sometimes. Okay, talk groups, the new concept. It's an ID number that identifies what group of people you wish to communicate with. It could be local communications or worldwide, and these are assigned on the system. I won't go there yet. Time slot is either time slot 1 or time slot 2. A talk group is assigned to one, but not both. So anything programmed on time slot 1 will not cross over to time slot 2 and vice versa. Color code is a kind of a private line tone Motorola term for repeater access. This allows us to do frequency reuse, and the codes are numbered from CC1 up to CC15. And the majorities of the repeater on the system use color code 1 for simplicity. Receive group, or an RX list, receive list, is a list of talk groups that your radio will receive outside of the talk group you're selected to. This allows you to hear other talk group activity on the one channel. The same or a similar thing to a receive group is digital monitor, or in some radios, it's promiscuous mode, which basically is a quote open squelch mode. It allows you to hear any and all activity on the frequency from either one or both time slots. It's most useful to hear all transmissions coming out of the repeater. I know I've heard people say, oh, you're going to go to digital, so you're going to use talk groups that I don't have so you can talk about me behind my back. No, not so. You can hear everything that we have to say. MMDVM is a multi-mode digital voice modem. These are used with hotspots such as ZumSpots, Shark RF, the N5BOC, which is a dual slot, full duplex board. It's pretty handy. OpenSpot and others. Most of those are single slot and do not run in full duplex. So you only can support one radio with it. The N5BOC will actually acts pretty much like a repeater. It's very handy. A code plug is a term for the radio programming data file that contains all of the radio configuration settings and repeater and talk group information. It is a commercial radio term that comes from primarily Motorola. They've called their plugs code plugs for ages. Motorola Moto Turbo, their trade name, including all the Generation 1 handhelds and mobiles. If you look at the bottom of the page on the left is a pair of, let's see, the top one is a 5550 and the bottom one's a 4350. The bottom one being a Generation 1, the top one being a Generation 2. Above those is a Connect System CS800. A couple of Motorola handhelds that you can get with nice displays, or even some that are just a half a dozen channels. This is a 578 next to those, and an 878 portable from Anytone. These are widely supported on the PNW DMR system, and as such are a really good choice to get. We've had very good luck with those radios. Motorola's have a few limitations to them, primarily because they were designed as commercial radios. One of the biggest being that it will only support 1,000 channels and only 1,000 radio IDs. And when you consider there's over 200,000 radio IDs in the world, you don't get the match. You have to have that database in there to correlate the radio ID that is sent over the air and the actual call sign. Let's see. Radio Oddity, Retivas, Baofeng also make inexpensive radios. Your mileage will vary with those, but people have had very good luck with them. Hytera used to be popular. Motorola is after them with a vengeance right now, so you may wind up with a brick, not be able to use it. Vertex Standard also has some standard tier 2 radios suitable for amateur DMR use. And again, some of these radios claim Part 90 acceptance, but it depends on the manufacturer and how you program it. And essentially, all Part 90 acceptance does, above and beyond Part 95 acceptance for amateur use, is the radio cannot be programmed from the front panel. You can only select the channels that have been programmed into it that you're authorized to use. So as long as you can keep it to a point where nobody can mess up any of the public safety or business band radios by using your radio improperly, then you're okay. DMR radios do have the ability to display a name and a call sign on the display, but this contacts list must be loaded into your radio. I briefly mentioned that before. And it's just a lookup list that takes the radio ID number, the DMR ID that's transmitted over the air, and does a quick lookup and displays the proper information on the display for you. So the radio only transmits your ID. Other users will only see that number unless you have their name and number loaded into the radio. Talker alias is a specification not yet supported, at least on the PNWDigital digital system. This does cause confusion on the network, so if you're going to play, please don't use that. I think Brandmeister does support that for some various things that I'm just really not aware of. This differs from D-Star or Fusion, where your radio transmits your call sign, which is rather handy. And there is the N0 GSG utility allows a scalable download and insertion of DMR radio ideas for some manufacturers' code plugs. And DMR radios also have an audible feedback. These are called talk permit tones, out of range tones, and end of transmission tones. The most important of those is the talk permit tone. The radio has to go through a little handshake with the network before you're actually allowed to transmit on the system. And this takes roughly a second and a half. So if you just, if you're used to your FM system, you key up the radio and you start talking, the first second or so is just going to be chopped off. It's gone. And all of a sudden you're talking, you're halfway through your call sign and we have no idea what's going on. So very, very important. Each radio user will need a unique ID before accessing the networks. These IDs are issued by radioid.net. Very easy to get. You just pop online, put in your information, they issue you a number, and you're on your merry way. As of a week ago, there's 233,000 plus radio ID numbers that have been issued worldwide. Most users will only need one ID number. You can use the same ID number in multiple radios. The only caveat is that you don't want to have both radios on the network at the same time, like giving one to your spouse. This will drive the C-Bridge completely out of its mind. Just as a note, this discussion will not go into radio programming. That topic requires its own presentation, trust me. Probably the biggest headache with DMR radios is getting your code plug built when there's something like 1,600 radio channel combinations. Things can get to be quite cumbersome. Not to fear, we do have tools that help, but mostly for the Anytone series radios. So, what is a talk group? It's a virtual channel on the DMR system. The talk group ID being transmitted tells the C-Bridge how to handle your call. So the C-Bridge is basically a point-to-multi-point system. It can either operate as a local repeater. You can have 2 or 3 repeaters tied together. You can have every single repeater on the entire network tied together and talking at the same time, depending on which talk group you pick. The talk group can also act as a tone squelch, only allowing you to hear activity on that talk group, provided you're not using digital monitor or RX groups, which you will then hear everything. The talk group name may have a number. This indicates the time slot used, like Washington 1 is on time slot 1. Washington 2 is on time slot 2. That's fairly consistent across the network. Like I mentioned, you can go either local on one repeater or be routed or potentially routed to every repeater in the network. This makes repeater coverage quite scalable depending on your push to talk talk group code group. I can't talk. A D-star comparison would be like being able to push to talk and bring up different reflectors. Okay, not all repeaters carry all talk groups. The repeater owners decide what talk groups are carried on their repeater and whether or not the talk groups are full-time or part-time. So some talk groups are carried on a repeater full-time. These are considered static, they're always on. When talk group active on the system, it will come up and be heard on the repeater with no other user interaction unless held off by a local repeater activity on another talk group. Conversation already on a repeater locally on a different talk group should not be bumped or interrupted. A 3-minute hold off is most common. This prevents people from coming in and swiping the repeater from you in the middle of your QSO. Some talk groups are carried on a repeater part-time. These are dynamic. A talk group that's only active when a repeater user has pushed to talk that talk group and made it active. Similar to knocking on the door and said, "Hi, I want to talk." Unless actively used by a local user, the talk group will only stay alive for a specified amount of time, and it will then time out and go back to sleep. 15 minutes is the common timeout, but will stay up as long as you continue to use the channel. It will continue to refresh the timer. PNW website has a talk group viewer, which is most handy for showing supported talk groups on the system by site. There's also a matrix that shows a whole mess of them together. And those look like, coming up, let's see. Did y'all get a new picture? No.
Yes.
Okay. Unfortunately, I can't see it. There we are. Okay, so this is available from the main menu off the PNWDigital website. You can select a site such as Cougar VHF, submit it. It gives you all the information that you need about the site, the radio frequencies, the color code, radio ID, which is internally used. You don't really need to know that. And then which talk groups are actually supported on that radio. And then the rule over here tells you if it's part-time and how long the hold-off timer is. So you can see at a glance what's full-time, what's part-time, and move from there. The other is the matrix, which is just a handy collection of a lot of related repeaters. This is, let's see, where am I? Southwest Washington, and go over here to Northwest Washington or Central Washington. So it gives you a lot of the repeaters that are co-located to each other, and gives you an idea of what's available and what's not available at a glance. It's quite helpful for putting your code plug together.
So Steve,
Yes.
question, could you explain again what the hold off timer is for?
Sure. So it's kind of an advanced term on the system. So there's two timers that start. When you key up on a talk group, it starts the hold off timer, which just says another talk group trying to come in on the network. Let's say I key up on Washington 1 and somebody comes in and they want to do something on, say, Cascades 1. Well, it's going to come in and it's going to see there's a hold off timer and it's set for 3 minutes. As long as I keep using that talk group, it's going to keep refreshing that. And it just keeps them from bumping into you and taking you off the network and taking over the channel. Does that make sense?
Wow, yeah, okay.
And then the other is the timeout, which is used on push to talk channels. When you push to talk into it, it will stay active whether you use it or not for whatever that P period is, like 15 minutes or 2 minutes, whatever. And
So
most
for
of
the-
these are very standard. And
So
then
for
if
the-
you go ahead.
So for the hold on timer, so long as somebody talks on that talk group every 3 minutes, it'll never be released off of that.
Correct.
Interesting. Thank you.
Steve, is that network wise or is that repeater wise? So if somebody, over in Eastern Washington heard us on Wash 2 and they keyed up on a time slot 2 talk group over there on a local repeater, would that hold off on that one as well?
It holds off on that repeater only, wherever they keyed up. It's not going to hold it off on the entire system unless he hits something like one of the PNW channels, PNW1 or PNW2. Those are network-wide channels. You key up one of those and you just took over the whole network.
Thank you.
Okay, so back to the show at hand.
Yep.
All righty. So we've seen all of that. So you have a DMR repeater on the air. Now what? It can function as both a standalone repeater, if that supports your needs, by using one of the local channels, or it can be connected to a DMR network. PNWDigital uses the RavenNet-c-Bridge to connect repeaters and the MMDVM servers. Most non-digital repeaters in the area are using, or I'm sorry, most non-PNW digital repeaters are using Brandmeister. Site linking for some repeater sites on PNWDigital is provided by HamWAN, but in most cases, sadly, it's on commercial internet. Wish we could get HamWAN everywhere. It's pretty handy. And for those of you that don't know, HamWAN is basically a point-to-point linking system that utilizes spectrum just above the 5 gig spectrum for Wi-Fi that's allocated for amateur use. So we're not restricted in power and can do lots of fun things. It works great. Unfortunately, DNR didn't like the way they played and kicked us off a whole bunch of sites last year. So that ends the general segment. Are there any questions outside of what we just had? Going once, twice, moving on. So what is the PNW DMR system? It's a system of approximately 70 plus DMR repeaters around Washington, Oregon, Idaho on VHF and UHF provided for general radio or amateur radio use. Most are suited for Pacific Northwest comms, but worldwide contacts are possible. There's USA 2, worldwide, there's several talk groups that'll get you out far and wide. Many of these repeaters are owned by individuals or clubs, and those entities are free to dictate the supported talk group deck to satisfy their own needs. Oops. MMDVM servers that allow various hotspots to connect into the system by users with little or poor coverage. Unfortunately, we wind up with a lot more people using hotspots to fill in their needs because they're primarily using portables, and portables just simply don't have the range that a mobile does. It's a similar problem that you have with FM. They only go so far. The goal is to provide a predictable, reliable radio experience, and we work pretty hard at making that so. PNW repeaters are linked with a device called a C-Bridge. It's manufactured by Rayfield Communications and can be either physical hardware or a virtual machine. We have both instances. The PNW repeaters, the network, are controlled by 3 C-Bridges. Repeaters in Western Washington are on PNWA, with the other repeaters on PNWD and PNWE for Eastern Washington and Oregon, respectively. These names also have nothing to do with PNW talk groups. They just happen to be what we call them. This allows for better local control of various PNW repeaters. Each repeater can be on its own manager, which is a set of rules, and be potentially independent from other nearby repeaters. Local 1 generally means local only to that repeater. There was a local 2. We have changed that to Metro 2, and in some areas, such as Seattle, there's a half a dozen repeaters that all respond to Metro 2 at the same time, even though local 1 remains individual for that repeater. That's also implemented down in Oregon. So there's some information on the PNWDigital webpage about which sites have been set up as Metro 2. So it's just a wider area local that the users in Oregon actually asked for. And then we can also switch talk groups on or off for specific or scheduled events on individual repeaters or network-wide. So this is kind of a 50,000 foot level of what it looks like on the system. You have your user devices out here. These are all conveniently portables. Go into Motorola Moto Turbo repeaters, which we use exclusively on the network. In this case, we've got 2 repeaters tied to 1 manager on the C-Bridge. The interesting thing about this, if you have 2 repeaters on the same manager, these both act exactly the same. So if you talk on time slot 1 here, this one's going to repeat the exact same time slot. And you can stack up to 15 of these out on 1 manager. It's pretty handy in certain situations, more of a commercial nature than in the amateur world. There's up to 50 managers on the C-Bridge, and then there's the talk group deck list in the back that says I have a call came in on one manager. Which managers do I send that call out to? One to many. There's also conference connections that go off to other C-Bridges and or other networks for international type or national or international connectivity. There's also the MMDVM servers that connect to a manager, and then the hotspots with the radios at your house. You can also do hotspots in your car using a Wi-Fi link off of your phone and connect it via Wi-Fi and carry your repeater with you, right handy. So this is an imperfect analogy of what a C-Bridge is. It's basically a router. It uses Internet Protocol Site connection, and it's basically a VLAN trunk. A talk group is a VLAN, a virtual local area network on that trunk, at least in the sense that the packet is tagged with a talk group ID. Each manager is a virtual switch that acts more like a hub. Each manager has one arbitrarily defined master member, and the rest of the members are peers. The master simply publishes the peer list. Every member is responsible for sending copies of every packet to every other member on the manager. The manager does not repeat anything. The C-Bridge is only an audio path for calls that route between multiple managers. The repeaters connect to the virtual switch manager, and their own programming configures VLAN interfaces for each talk group. Probably more information than you really cared to know. This is a map of repeaters that we currently have out on the network. The gray ones are sites that have temporarily gone dark. The black ones are C-Bridge locations, so they're spread across the country. The ones with the red dots up on top are over in British Columbia. They're an affiliated network, along with one with a white star over here that you can't see. Is also an affiliated network. They have their own repeater, their own C-Bridge, and are connected to PNWDigital. So Brandmeister, a little bit that I can tell you about it. It's a virtual DMR network. And it can also support GPS location functions with appropriate equipment. It's basically a collection of servers, and you have to have a log on and authentication key to connect to the server. And then you're just selecting talk groups. It can be used with repeaters, or you connect to it with hotspots. A lot of guys on the network here either have a dual home so they can connect to PNWDigital or to Brandmeister, or they just have two of them, one on each. Some of the talk groups on Brandmeister are linked to PNW DMR system. Washington 1, which has got some support. PNW Regional 2, which is actually our talk group, but it's present on Brandmeister so that you can get in if you're out on the Brandmeister network. Oregon 1, Idaho 1, Montana 2 are all connected. TAC 310 through 312, which are tactical channels on Brandmeister, and very busy, by the way. And Bridge 2, which is basically just a giant party line, and it's interesting to listen to if you just, I mean, people kind of keep things short, and you hear from people all across the country. get on and say what they have to say and then move on and somebody else comes along. It's kind of neat. Some folks tend to think that PNW is too restrictive. There's not enough traffic, and this gives them something to listen to alleviate the boredom. Okay, recommended talk groups for general use around PNW DMR. As we've mentioned, there's local 1 and local or metro 2. These are conversations local to that repeater, minimum use of system resources. Washington 1 and Washington 2 is basically on the western side of Washington, although many of the repeaters on the eastern side do support at least Washington 1 as a hailing channel. If they do support Washington 2, it's typically on a push-to-talk basis. Again, you can look at the matrix and tell if it's full-time or push-to-talk. PNW1 and PNW2 are hailing channels. They're not for long QSOs. They wake up every repeater connected to the system. So, yeah, just getting on there and carrying on a conversation is not going to make you tremendously popular. PNW Regional 2 is full-time linked to Brandmeister, as is Oregon 1, Idaho 1. Don't see the other one listed. Cascades East is Eastern Washington. There's Audio Test and Parrot that we've heard about. There's also specific channels. These are tactical channels. TAC 1 through 3 are specific to PNW DMR and not to be confused with TAC 310 through 312. So if you've got somebody, say in, Portland, Seattle, and Spokane, and you guys want to carry on a conversation, sure, you could light up Washington 2 and have a good time. Of course, everybody else in the network gets to listen to a lot of it. Or you can move over to one of the tactical channels. And these are all, despite the number, on time slot 2. So you'll see them listed a little bit differently on the talk group listing. It'll say TAC 1-2 and 2-2. Those are really quite handy for carrying on conversations and minimizing the amount of resources on the system that you're lighting up. The other nice thing, if somebody's using TAC 1, you can go over and use TAC 2, even though it's on time slot 2, they're only tying up time slot 2 on 3 repeaters. You can take time slot 2 on another couple of repeaters and tie them up. So it gives the system a little bit more efficient usage. And there is a list on the website of all of the talk groups that are supported and basically what their function in life is. So we've talked about this before, the full-time versus part-time talk group. And these are the talk group is active when the repeater is, oh, come on. So with full-time, with a 3-minute hold off, this talk group is active on the repeater full-time. Activity on this talk group on this repeater will hold off other talk groups coming up on that time slot for 3 minutes after the last push to talk. And then after 3 months, other talk groups on that time slot will start coming through again. Another push to talk on that time slot and the repeater for another talk group will override. So then the same thing for part-time, it only is active when you push to talk on it, and it will stay active for 15 minutes after last transmission on that talk group. There are some exceptions to that, like Oregon 1 on Monday nights is push to talk on most of the network except Oregon, where it's full-time, any of the Oregon repeaters. But at 0700, it gets turned on the C-Bridge across the network so that it's always up for the next hour during the net. So you don't, don't have to worry about push to talk and having the thing time out and the network goes soft on you. So the basic information needed to access a talk group is going to be your DMR ID number programmed into the radio, the repeater input and output frequencies, the color code, and the talk group idea for that particular channel that you want, and the time slot of the talk group. Excuse me for just a second. Sorry. Okay, zones can be created. These tend to confuse people more than anything, but zones are just a folder that you can put similar channels in. So you can have a zone for each repeater, and that repeater will have channels for each of the talk groups that you want, even though the input and output frequencies are all the same for every channel. What varies is the talk group. So you can just select right down the line, go to a repeater you want, pick the talk group you want, and you're on your merry way. You can also create a zone for, say, Washington 2. I just want to listen to Washington 2 wherever I go. So you can put all the channels in there where the frequencies will be different for each repeater, but all the talk groups will be Washington 2. So zones are up to the user, and they're really not anything to be too terribly confused with. Pay attention to the matrix and only program in talk groups supported by that repeater. Each repeater is different, and using a non-supported talk group on a repeater will just be an unresolved call on the network. It will be heard locally, but not passed on to the network. As I mentioned before, code plug work is time intensive. We do have starter code plugs for most of the radios out there. And specifically for the anytones, we have things that make the tones a little bit more pleasant and make sure that the talk permit tone is on and things of that nature. Then we also publish a file every night that has everything listed for the entire network, and you can take and import what you need into the Anytone customer programming software and load it into your radio. It's a pretty painless process of building a code plug. I can build up a whole code plug in less than 5 minutes if I really try, versus hours and hours of sitting there trying to put it in manually. It's a very error-prone process. Call Watch is a utility that allows you to monitor activity on the system. It also makes it easier to monitor your own performance, and it's accessed from the top line of various PNWDigital pages. And that looks something like, come on, that. So this is showing you where the call came in, what repeater, who the person is. And it also shows you received signal strength indicator, which is a handy number to know. With the lower the number is, down to about minus 127 being the bottom end, that the system will receive, all the way up to minus 50, minus 40 on a really hot signal. So this gives you an idea how well you're getting into the network, which is always good to know. We offer a bunch of different multimode digital voice servers for hotspot devices. This is a list of them. They all have cute little names. These servers have their own C-Bridge managers and have unique talk groups that they support. Not each of these servers has the same talk group deck. So you kind of have to, again, look at the matrix and see what supports what you're after. All of the servers except Demi, Rex, and Ted are single slot devices, and it's not as critical in programming the radios to make them work. The server will do the time slot work. And these are for PNW DMR Digital members. It should only be used if you're outside of repeater range. We are a repeater network first, with access provided as a courtesy. But unfortunately, they're dependent on much more than they should be. But it's very hard to make a network that works very well for portable devices. Just ask the cellular industry. There's a best practices. I'm not going to go over this, but it is on the PNWDigital.net best practices website. And it's just a couple of things to think about as you're working on the system. I will point out one thing here. Go back. No, you're not going to go back. How annoying. There is our Not a Net meeting. There we go. Which is tonight at 1900 hours. So become a gathering regular for our Not a Net Wednesday, 1900 on PNWR2. That needs to be updated. This is designed for new users, which would be some of you. We want to help our new users first, so please ask questions. It's a very loose check-in for the first part of the net, and then we take questions over the air and discuss them and give you solutions as we can. And then we also have a Zoom session following the voice session that starts roughly at 8 o'clock. And we can go into much more detail and do screen shares and a lot of things like that. So if you're just hopelessly stuck, we've got means to help you out, and we're more than happy to do so. And since most of you are in PNW, the Pacific Northwest, I will direct you to the PNW DMR website, which is https://PNWDigital.net. And with that, I am done.